Hello, America. My name is Dylan John, and you are listening to Nature and the Nation. For today's show, I'll be looking at essays on a Science of Mythology, and this is by both Carl Jung and Carl Kerenyi. It was first published in 1949. I have the 1989 edition here, but nothing has been changed. And it's a number of essays in this book that are written by either Carl Kerenyi or by Carl Jung. And it opens with a few essays by Kerenyi, and then Jung starts to respond with a couple essays of his own to the various essays that Kerenyi puts forward. And they talk about the archetype of the child, or the divine child, and they talk about Persephone and Demeter, and I want to focus on the concept of the child god, or the divine child, or just the archetype of the child in this episode. I'm going to leave out the stuff about Persephone. And of the sections I want to read, most of them are actually Carl Jung's. I'm going to open with a few readings from Kerenyi, and then I'm going to move into the stuff that Jung wrote, and we'll examine that. So, in the last episode, I talked about Baby New Year a little bit in contrast to Father Time, and I kind of want to carry that out a little bit further and think about the concept of the child, or the baby, or the youth as representing the future, as a sort of archetype that carries with it consciousness and presence and awareness, and the future, perhaps like the near future, maybe more so, the possibilities of the future, and just in general an archetype that is the archetype of the future and all the things that come with it. And also just the archetype of childhood itself. So, with that said, I'm going to read a few sections. Like I said, I'll start off with some of Kerenyi's writing, and then I'll move into Jung. So, Carl Kerenyi here says, quote, "Ancient mythologians of child gods are surrounded by and evoke an aura of fairy tale, not for any unaccountable, essentially irrational reason, but rather because of their clearly visible and ever-recurring characteristics. The child god is usually an abandoned foundling. Often it is threatened by extraordinary dangers. It may be devoured, like Zeus, or torn to pieces, like Dionysus. On the other hand, these dangers are not altogether surprising. They are features, as natural to the vision of a titanic world as discord and trickery are to the primitive mythologians. Sometimes the father is the child's enemy, as was Kronos, or he may be merely absent, as Zeus was when Dionysus was being torn to pieces by the Titans. We have a rarer case in the Homeric hymn to Pan. Little Pan was abandoned by his mother and nurse. Terrified, they had let the newborn infant lie there. His father, Hermes, picked him up, wrapped him in a hare's skin, and bore him away to Olympus. Here again we have two contrasting fates. In the one, the child god is an abandoned abortion. In the other, he sits at Zeus's side among the gods. The mother has a peculiar part to play. She is and is not at the same time. To take an ancient Italic example, the child Tages, from whom the Etruscans received their sacred science, sprang out of the earth before the eyes of a plowman, a child of Mother Earth, and at the same time the purest type of fatherless and motherless foundling. Semele was already dead when Dionysus was born, and the mother of Asclepios did not survive her son's birth. We could also mention figures in heroic sagas who were likewise abandoned by their mothers as children, violently separated from them, or exposed to death. But we would rather confine ourselves to mythology properly so called, and shall only tell of gods who occupy a central place in genuine mythologians and cults. Even to the greatest among them, Zeus, something very similar happened. When he was born, his mother, in order to save him at all, exposed him. the nursing of the child by divinities or wild beasts in the myth of Zeus, and the imitation of it in the cult of young Dionysus show us two things: the solitariness of the child god, and the fact that he is nevertheless at home in the primeval world, an equivocal situation at once that of the orphan child and a cherished son of the gods. Another variation on the theme is when the mother shares the child's abandonment and solitude. She wanders about homeless and is persecuted like Leto, whom her newborn son, the little Apollo, defends against the brutal Tityos. Or else she lives without honor, far from Olympus, like Maia, the mother of Hermes. Her position, originally that of Mother Earth, one of whose names she bears, is no longer entirely simple in the Homeric hymn. The simple situation shows us the abandonment of the newborn god in both variations. In the one, mother and child are abandoned, as Leto was with Apollo on the barren island of Delos. In the other, the child is alone in the rough and primitive world. Here, the fairy tale atmosphere becomes concrete. We are reminded of the orphan child in European and Asiatic folklore and how he was abandoned. No matter where it was or was not, enough that there was a town, and in the southern quarter of the town a tumble-down house inhabited by an orphan child, left all on its own after the death of its father and mother. So begins a Hungarian legend. There are parallels, both to the variation in which the child is wholly abandoned, and to that in which it is left with mother or nurse. End quote. Okay, so basically just pointing out a common theme here in myths, particularly the Greek myths, about the child god. So in a lot of cases, the various gods have stories about how they were born or how they were created or what they were like when they were children. Even Zeus himself is a child of Saturn. Zeus's brothers and sisters were all eaten by Saturn, and Zeus was hidden away. Eventually he took his revenge and he freed his brothers and sisters. But it's this common theme, in addition to like the theme of the gods as children, this common theme that they're abandoned when they're young. So you see a couple things. One of them is that in Greek mythology, there's not really a singular god of childhood or child god. There are a few, like Harpocrates, that are commonly represented as children, but they don't really just like wholeheartedly represent childhood and children as the god of children. But all of the major gods have stories about when they were children. So it's a difference to say the child god versus the god of children, although there's certainly archetypal components of childhood that would come through in the god as child. It's also important to remember that a lot of that god as child is going to be representative of the particular attributes of that god. So Apollo as child, you're going to see the components of Apollo shining through this story of this child god. More so, I think, than you're just going to see this raw archetype of childhood on its own. But there are commonalities, and one of them is often that the child is abandoned. It's an orphan. It's abandoned by its mother. It's abandoned by its father. It's abandoned by both. Or it springs up without parents out of the ground. In some sense, it's a singular entity alone by itself. And I think that's kind of important when thinking archetypally, because the concept of the child has to be sort of self-sustaining. And if it's perpetually in the shadow of a more powerful figure, like a father god or mother god, it doesn't really stand on its own as much as when the god is abandoned as a child and is an orphan and is now like a singular, unique entity. And there's also a thing that comes about with child gods where they're both weak and powerful. So they're like abandoned, left to be exposed to the elements, like Pan, who's then brought by Hermes, who is apparently Pan's father, brought by Hermes to Olympus. So it's got this, like, in the home of the gods and also abandoned on the earth. There's a duality here. It's like weak and small and tender and exposed, vulnerable, naive. And then there's also this like the conquering child, the powerful child, as if like the most powerful was the child. So there's a sort of duality there and a transformation from the weakest to the strongest sort of phenomena that occurs when discussing concepts like the child archetype. Jumping from there a little bit further, still reading from Kerenyi, he says, quote, "The childhood and orphan's fate of the child gods have not evolved from the stuff of human life, but from the stuff of cosmic life. What appears to be biographical in mythology is, as it were, an anecdote of the world, that the world relates from its own biography, in dreams, visions, and far more vividly and graphically than in these, more vividly and graphically than is ever possible for the profane arts, in mythology. To take mythological images as allegories of natural phenomena would be tantamount to robbing mythology of that nucleus, which alone gives it life and meaning. It would be to rob it of its timelessly valid human and more than human, i.e., cosmic content, which mythologically is expressed in the images of gods, just as in music, mathematics, or philosophy it is expressed in musical, mathematical, or philosophical ideas. Hence the relations of mythology to science, hence its spiritual character, by virtue of which it, like science, transcends the individual phenomena. A mythologium speaks for itself, acts for itself, and is true of itself, just like any other lofty scientific theory or musical creation, or indeed any true work of art." End quote. A short section there, but just sort of pointing to a couple of ideas. One of them is that it's not necessarily a biographical story, even if you're looking at like the birth of Zeus, the childhood of Zeus, or the childhood of one of these other gods. It's not really. I mean, it's kind of presented in the form of like, well, first Zeus was born, and then he was a child, and then he was an adult, and there's a sort of biography that happens, but it taps into something more where like the concept of the child remains a mythological figure and remains a figure that is worshipped. So people will worship the child Zeus. As an archetypal concept, it continues. It doesn't stand in a sort of sequence of like once they worshipped the child Zeus, but now they worship the adult Zeus or something like that. It stands on its own, and it represents something more cosmic than just a biographical sequence, but it represents something that is maybe cosmically, or perhaps the right word is metaphysically, or perhaps the right word is phenomenologically. It's kind of hard to pinpoint, but something speaks to something deeper. It speaks to something that has to do with the very nature of reality. The creation and destruction of things in the world, the unveiling of things, the awakening of things from a state of non-existence into a state of existence is sort of like the birth of things. And that is like a metaphysical principle of reality, perhaps a structure of reality that's manifested as myth. And that creation process, that newness, that vast open vista of possibility, these are sort of things that constitute the very fabric of reality. In that sense, they're like cosmic archetypes. So I thought that's an interesting perspective. And then let's see, the last section that I'm going to read from Kerenyi is this part here, where he says, quote, "Thus, the mythologium of the primordial child existed in ancient Italy, as in Crete, and in the older strata of Greek religion on the mainland. It was as alien to the Homeric hierarchy of the gods as it was to the genuinely Roman pantheon, or rather, it became alienated from them. We cannot with any certainty derive it from Crete, nor ascribe it exclusively to the sphere of old Mediterranean culture. We can, however, assert that in Crete there existed an older sphere of culture that embraced pre-Homeric Greece and ancient Italy, the spirit of which was more fundamentally mythological than the spirit of Homer or Rome. The mythologium of the primordial child is characteristic not of this more recent, but of an older mentality. That the spirit of this older sphere was fundamentally mythological is certain, though its temporal and spatial boundaries are not so certain. For an age of primitive mythology still projects into the historical epics of Greece and Italy. We have now won a vantage point from which the classic youthfulness of the Greek gods can be understood and judged correctly, not merely ontologically, as in our first chapter, but historically. Central to the Olympian order, which replaced the primitive mythological state of things, is Zeus the Father. In spite of that, he is represented in his Dictaean birthplace as a beardless youth, and worshipped in this form elsewhere in Crete. Thus far, those scholars are right who interpreted the Megistos Kouros of the hymn as the biggest boy. Greek religion, in its classical form, is the religion of the world order established by Zeus, as related in Hesiod. The images of divine childhood are relegated to the margin of the new Zeus world, and the primordial child of mythology remains outside its borders. In this religion, the youth is a more acceptable manifestation of divinity than the child. The youthfulness of Greek divinities is the result of a transformation, albeit a different one from that which can be deduced from the artistic remains by themselves. In the monuments, the reign of the bearded gods precedes the age of the youths. We see now that the reign of the child is still older. The image of the primordial child breaks through, transfigured into the ideal figure of the youth. That such a transformation is possible is implicit in the meaning of the Greek word for boy, and is therefore attested by etymology as well. The supposedly male child, while yet in its mother's womb, is called Kouros. The ephebe and the youth capable of bearing arms is still a Kouros. Eros himself appears in well-known vase paintings as a winged ephebe. The divine youths of classic Greek art, the classic ideals of Apollo, Hermes, and the young Dionysus, are not to be taken as indicating a general rejuvenescence of the Hellenic world. It is not that the bearded divinities have gone back on their development. Even in the Iliad, Hermes appears as a youth. But that the idealized ephebe of the agonal age gave validity to the divine child in a somewhat maturer form, more in keeping with the essence of those divinities than that of the full-grown man. End quote. So what do we see here? What is he saying? He's saying basically that the mythologium of the primordial child existed both in early Italy and in early Greece, way back in history, prior to the Homeric epics, prior to the arrival of the Greeks who worshipped Zeus and what would become the Romans, the sort of pre-existing peoples of Europe. Supposedly, according to research, and I do think this is sort of still up for debate, but supposedly was a much more matriarchal, much more feminine gods and goddesses. Well, really, the Earth Mother or the Great Goddess was the chief among the deities, and so they had like child deities as well, or the concept of the primordial child or the divine child was very powerful in this early matriarchal, possibly, early European culture. And then with the arrival of, say, the Indo-Europeans, who would go on to conquer much of this land, sky father deities became more prominent. Zeus, Jupiter, they sort of supplanted the older deities, and so the concept of the divine child sort of receded to the background, but then at a later point returned, but in a different form, now in a form of younger, unbearded gods and goddesses. So Hermes and Apollo, let's say, these gods had often been depicted as bearded, but then in order to, I guess, reconnect with this older divine child motif, there was a sort of synthesis where the gods were represented as young men, as youths, but not exactly as children. So that's an interesting approach there. Anyway, let's move on to Carl Jung, where he begins to talk about the archetype. And now we step away a bit from mythology and step a bit more into psychology. Although, Jung understands the mission, and he does bring this back to mythology quite frequently. But in discussing archetypes, what archetypes are, he kind of gives lays out a foundation for his theory. So Carl Jung here, talking about archetypes, says, quote, "In recent times, it was medical psychology that approached the problem of the unconscious without philosophical preconceptions. It became clear from many separate investigations that the psychopathology of the neuroses and of many psychoses cannot dispense with the hypothesis of a dark side of the psyche, i.e., the unconscious. It is the same with the psychology of dreams, which is really the terra intermedia between normal and pathological psychology. In the dream, as in the product of psychoses, there are numberless interconnections to which one can find parallels only in mythological associations of ideas, or perhaps in certain poetic creations, which are often characterized by a borrowing, not always conscious, from myths. Had thorough investigation shown that in the majority of such cases it was simply a matter of forgotten knowledge, the physician would not have gone to the trouble of making extensive researches into individual and collective parallels. But in point of fact, typical mythologisms were observed among individuals to whom all knowledge of this kind was absolutely out of the question, and where indirect derivation from religious ideas that might have been known to them or from popular figures of speech was impossible. Such conclusions forced us to assume that we must be dealing with autochthonous revivals independent of all tradition, and consequently that myth-forming structural elements must be present in the unconscious psyche. These products are never, or at least very seldom, myths with a definite form, but rather mythological components, which, because of their typical nature, we can call motifs, primordial images, types, or as I have named them, archetypes. The child archetype is an excellent example. Today we can hazard the formula that the archetypes appear in myths and fairy tales just as they do in dreams and in the products of psychotic fantasy. The medium in which they are embedded is, in the former case, an ordered and for the most part immediately understandable context, but in the latter case a generally unintelligible, irrational, not to say delirious sequence of images, which nonetheless does not lack a certain hidden coherence. In the individual, the archetypes appear as involuntary manifestations of unconscious processes, whose existence and meaning can only be inferred, whereas the myth deals with traditional forms of incalculable age. They hark back to a prehistoric world, whose spiritual preconceptions and general conditions we can still observe today among existing primitives. Myths on this level are, as a rule, tribal history, handed down from generation to generation by word of mouth." End quote. All right, so what we have here basically is him saying that studies into the mind have demonstrated that there is a what he calls the dark side of the psyche, or the unconscious. And we see this through dreams and through psychosis. And what we find is that mythological associations of ideas or mythological concepts spring up in the dreams and in the psychopathology. And the conclusion, he says, such conclusions forced us to assume that we must be dealing with autochthonous revivals, independent of all tradition, and consequently that myth-forming structural elements must be present in the unconscious psyche. Myth-forming structural elements present in the unconscious psyche. So the idea here is that there are structures to the unconscious, there are shapes, there are forms that are inherent to the unconscious mind, and they represent themselves individually as dreams and as psychosis and as fantasy and as art and poetry, and they manifest themselves culturally as mythology. Now, obviously, not every group of people develops the same mythology, and so the question remains that to what extent are all different people's structural unconscious identical, and to what extent are different peoples, different ethnic groups, or different cultures, or what have you, their unconscious structures different from one another? That's an ongoing question, and it's not easily answered. It's not easily answered in this book. I think that Jung tends to assume that what he's really dealing with are archetypes that are so deep that they transcend ethnic groups. So especially in researchers who will look at different mythological systems and draw conclusions about a sort of common mythological structures, they're finding the commonalities. The hero's journey represents itself in this culture in this way, or in this culture in this way, or like the divine child represents itself in Greece this way, but then represents itself in Indonesia or in Hawaii or somewhere else. It'll represent itself slightly differently. So there's commonalities, but there's differences, and where those differences lie and the cause of those differences is something that's certainly not resolved in the course of this book. So moving on from there, talking a little bit more about the unconscious, he says, quote, "It is not the world as we know it that speaks out of the unconscious, but the unknown world of the psyche, of which we know that it mirrors our empirical world only in part, and that, for the other part, it molds this empirical world in accordance with its own psychic assumptions. The archetype does not proceed from physical facts, but describes how the psyche experiences the physical fact, and in so doing the psyche often behaves so autocratically that it denies tangible reality or makes statements that fly in the face of it. The primitive mentality does not invent myths, it experiences them. Myths are original revelations of the preconscious psyche, involuntary statements about unconscious psychic happenings, and anything but allegories of physical processes. Such allegories would be an idle amusement for an unscientific intellect. Myths, on the contrary, have a vital meaning. Not merely do they represent, they are the psychic life of the primitive tribe, which immediately falls to pieces and decays when it loses its mythological heritage, like a man who has lost his soul. A tribe's mythology is its living religion, whose loss is always and everywhere, even among the civilized, a moral catastrophe. But religion is a vital link with psychic processes, independent of and beyond consciousness in the dark hinterland of the psyche. Many of these unconscious processes may be directly occasioned by consciousness, but never by conscious choice. Others appear to arise spontaneously, that is to say, from no discernible or demonstrable conscious cause. Modern psychology treats the products of unconscious fantasy activity as self-portraits of what is going on in the unconscious, or as statements of the unconscious psyche about itself. They fall into two categories. First, fantasies, including dreams, of a personal character, which go back unquestionably to personal experiences, things forgotten or repressed, and can thus be completely explained by individual anamnesis. Second, fantasies, including dreams, of an impersonal character, which cannot be reduced to experiences of the individual's past, and thus cannot be explained as something individually acquired. These fantasy images undoubtedly have their closest analogues in mythological types. We must therefore assume that they correspond to certain collective and not personal structural elements of the human psyche in general, and like the morphological elements of the human body, are inherited. Although tradition and transmission by migration certainly play a part, there are, as we have said, very many cases that cannot be accounted for in this way, and drive us to the hypothesis of autochthonous revival. These cases are so numerous that we are obliged to assume the existence of a collective psychic substratum. I have called this the collective unconscious. The products of this second category resemble the types of structures to be met with in myth and fairy tale so much that we must regard them as related. It is therefore wholly within the realm of possibility that both the mythological types as well as the individual types arise under quite similar conditions. As already mentioned, the fantasy products of the second category, as also those of the first, arise in a state of reduced intensity of consciousness, in dreams, delirium, reveries, visions, etc. In all these states, the check put upon unconscious contents by the concentration of the conscious mind ceases, so that the hitherto unconscious material streams into the field of consciousness. End quote. Okay, so you got a nice little section there. Let's see at what the major points were that he was making. He essentially says that myths are not just explanations, allegories of physical processes, stories created to explain the things seen in the world. The sun comes up and then it goes down and then it comes back up again where it started. Somehow it traveled from where it went down to where it comes up, and they come up with a story of what happens to the sun through its journey through the underworld. And it's not just like an allegory or a story of like, why do spiders weave webs? Here's a mythological story to explain it. But they go much deeper than that, and they tap into parts of what makes us humans, what makes us have feelings, and what makes us care about the world, and what motivates us to take one action rather than the other. It's incredibly deep. He says not merely do they represent, but they are the psychic life of the primitive tribe, which immediately falls to pieces and decays when it loses its mythological heritage. So the mythology is so important to the society that if you take it away and replace it with something else, the society very likely will simply collapse on itself or in some other way degenerate or come about as a sort of like wounded society because its myths have been taken from it or have been somehow discredited. That can be very damaging. That can be an extremely damaging experience for a group, especially a group that is not particularly powerful in the world stage, to have their mythologies dismantled before their very eyes. He calls it a moral catastrophe, and even among the civilized, a moral catastrophe. And he says that there are fantasies and dreams of a personal character and fantasies and dreams of an impersonal character, which cannot be reduced to experiences in the individual's past. So he sort of divides it up. There's personal stuff. There's unconscious personal stuff that you went through when you were a kid or whatever. That's not something that doesn't exist, but it's not the whole story. There's also unconscious components that have nothing to do with things that have happened to you. He calls these the impersonal fantasies and dreams. He says those impersonal fantasies and dreams have their closest analogs in mythological types, and he says that we must therefore assume they correspond to collective structural elements of the human psyche in general. So here you're talking about things that all people share. Again, this is the difference between the personal unconscious and the collective unconscious. The collective unconscious doesn't mean we all share one mind, like some New Agers might try to spin it. The collective unconscious is something that we each share a part of. We each have this array of unconscious structures in our mind. And we all have a similar array of unconscious structures, and the sum of those is the collective unconscious. So that's the idea. And in states of dreams, delirium, reveries, visions, the conscious mind and its concentration relaxes and no longer has control over the psyche, and in that sort of relaxed, delirious, reverie type of state, the contents of the unconscious mind are more ready to step forward and make themselves known. Pretty interesting. So let's move on. He says, quote, "The methodological principle in accordance with which psychology treats the products of the unconscious is this. Contents of an archetypal character are manifestations of processes in the collective unconscious. Hence, they do not refer to anything that is or has been conscious, but to something essentially unconscious. In the last analysis, therefore, it is impossible to say what they refer to. Every interpretation necessarily remains an as-if. The ultimate core of meaning may be circumscribed, but not described. Even so, the bare circumscription denotes an essential step forward in our knowledge of the preconscious structure of the psyche, which was already in existence when there was as yet no unity of personality. Even today, the primitive is not securely possessed of it, and no consciousness at all. We can also observe this preconscious state in early childhood, and as a matter of fact, it is the dreams of this early period that not infrequently bring extremely remarkable archetypal contents to light. If, then, we proceed in accordance with the above principle, then there is no longer any question whether a myth refers to the sun or the moon, the father or the mother, sexuality or fire or water. All it does is to circumscribe and give an approximate description of an unconscious core of meaning. The ultimate meaning of this nucleus was never conscious and never will be. It was, and still is, only interpreted, and every interpretation that comes anywhere near the hidden sense, or from the point of view of scientific intellect, nonsense, which comes to the same thing, has always, right from the beginning, laid claim not only to absolute truth and validity, but to instant reverence and religious devotion. Archetypes were, and still are, living psychic forces that demand to be taken seriously, and they have a strange way of making sure of their effect. Always, they were the bringers of protection and salvation, and their violation has as its consequence the perils of the soul, known to us from the psychology of primitives. Moreover, they are the unfailing causes of neurotic and even psychotic disorders, behaving exactly like neglected or maltreated physical organs or organic functional systems. An archetypal content expresses itself, first and foremost, in metaphors. If such a content should speak of the sun and identify with it the lion, the king, the hoard of gold guarded by the dragon, or the power that makes for the life and health of man, it is neither the one thing nor the other, but the unknown third thing, that finds more or less adequate expression in all these similes, yet to the perpetual vexation of the intellect remains unknown and not to be fitted into a formula. For this reason, the scientific intellect is always inclined to put on airs of enlightenment in the hope of banishing the spectre once and for all. Whether its endeavors were called euhemerism, or Christian apologetics, or enlightenment in the narrow sense, or positivism, there was always a myth hiding behind it, in new and disconcerting garb, which then, following the ancient and venerable pattern, gave itself out as ultimate truth. In reality, we can never legitimately cut loose from our archetypal foundations unless we are prepared to pay the price of a neurosis, any more than we can rid ourselves of our body and its organs without committing suicide. If we cannot deny the archetypes or otherwise neutralize them, we are confronted at every new stage in the differentiation of consciousness to which civilization attains, with the task of finding a new interpretation appropriate to this stage in order to connect the life of the past that still exists in us with the life of the present, which threatens to slip away from it. If this link-up does not take place, a kind of rootless consciousness comes into being no longer oriented to the past, a consciousness which succumbs helplessly to all manner of suggestions and in practice is susceptible to psychic epidemics. With the lost of the past, now become insignificant, devalued, and incapable of revaluation, the Savior is lost too, for the Savior is either the insignificant thing itself or else arises out of it. Over and over again in the metamorphosis of the gods, he rises up as the prophet or firstborn of a new generation and appears unexpectedly in the unlikeliest places, sprung from a stone, tree, furrow, water, etc., and in ambiguous form, Tom Thumb, dwarf, child, animal, and so on. This archetype of the child god is extremely widespread and intimately bound up with all the other mythological aspects of the child motif. End quote. Okay, so that was a slightly longer section there, but what is the interesting parts here? Well, he basically says that the myths and the dreams and so on and so forth, these are all metaphors. He says every interpretation necessarily remains an as-if. In the last analysis, it's impossible to say what they refer to. The ultimate core of meaning may be circumscribed but not described. So then he talks a little bit later about like the sun and the king, the lion, the hoard of gold, life, power, that none of these things are really themselves. None of them stand for the other, but they stand for an unknown third thing that finds adequate, more or less adequate expression in all of these similes. And yet, to the perpetual vexation of the intellect, it remains unknown. So the archetype itself, the root structure, can't be known. It can't be understood as a thing. It's more of like a way of thinking, a way of perceiving that has metaphorical similes or manifestations in certain concepts that stand in for this more hidden, unknown, and unknowable deep archetype. So that's kind of the premise there. Another thing that he says that's interesting is that every interpretation that comes anywhere near the hidden sense has always, right from the beginning, laid claim not only to absolute truth and validity, but to instant reverence and religious devotion. So the minute we begin to perceive more closely the contents of the unconscious, the more we start to say, oh, that's absolutely true. This thing that has come into my consciousness, this thing that has come into my field of awareness, this force that's representing itself in my life feels true or correct in a deeper and more perhaps transcendent way, like extremely true, truer than true, and fosters a religious or spiritual devotion of some sort. It seems larger than life to us and seems like religious or spiritual experiences when we come closer to interacting with or comprehending the contents of the unconscious. And he says we can never legitimately cut loose from our archetypal foundations unless we're prepared to pay the price of a neurosis, any more than we can rid ourselves of our body and its organs. So they're part of us, they're part of our brains. We cannot be rid of them, just like you can't be rid of your body parts unless you mutilate yourself, and to try to deny the subconscious and collective unconscious its capacity to sway your sense of the world and your sense of meaning. You become sort of deformed as you cut these things out of your conscious life. The more you deny them the capacity to speak to your consciousness, the more sort of malformed you become. He says now we have this new stage of civilization, and he says the task of finding a new interpretation appropriate to this stage is what we need in order to connect the life of the past that still exists within us with the life of the present. So we're trying to connect our deep past, our deep roots, with the present world, and linking up the present world to the past and to our collective unconscious keeps us sane, really. Absent that connection, he says, a kind of rootless consciousness comes into being, no longer oriented to the past, a consciousness which succumbs helplessly to all manner of suggestions. In practice, is susceptible to psychic epidemics. Modernity, right there, kind of denial of the past and an argument with the past, against the past. And he also does tie here at the end of the section the concept of the child God with the concept of the Savior. And essentially the Savior rises up as the prophet or firstborn of a new generation. So the sort of the birth of a new maybe generation of gods, a new manifestation of gods, a new way of interacting with the mythology of the past and the collective unconscious. That new interaction, that new form of interaction is represented by the image or the concept of the child God. So in keeping with the connection with the ancient past, he says, quote, "As to the psychology of our theme, I must point out that every statement going beyond the purely phenomenal aspects of an archetype lays itself open to the criticism we have expressed above. Not for a moment dare we succumb to the illusion that an archetype can be finally explained and disposed of. Even the best attempts at explanation are only more or less successful translations into another metaphorical language. Indeed, language itself is only an image. The most we can do is to dream the myth onwards and give it a modern dress. And whatever explanation or interpretation does to it, we do to our own souls as well, with corresponding results for our own well-being. The archetype, let us never forget this, is a psychic organ present in all of us. A bad explanation means a correspondingly bad attitude to this organ, which may thus be injured. But the ultimate sufferer is the bad interpreter himself. Hence, the explanation should always be such that the functional significance of the archetype remains unimpaired, so that an adequate and meaningful connection between the conscious mind and the archetypes is assured. For the archetype is an element of our psychic structure, and thus a vital and necessary component in our psychic economy. It represents, or personifies, certain instinctive data of the dark, primitive psyche, the real but invisible roots of consciousness. Of what elementary importance the connection with these roots is, we see from the preoccupation of the primitive mentality with certain magic factors, which are nothing less than what we would call archetypes. This original form of religio, linking back, is the essence, the working basis of all religious life even today, and always will be, whatever future form this life may take. There is no rational substitute for the archetype, any more than there is for the cerebellum or the kidneys. We can examine the physical organs anatomically, histologically, and embryologically. This would correspond to an outline of archetypal phenomenology and its presentation in terms of comparative history. But we only arrive at the meaning of a physical organ when we begin to ask teleological questions. Hence, the query arises: what is the biological purpose of the archetype? Just as physiology answers such questions for the body, so it is the business of psychology to answer it for the archetype. Statements like, the child motif is a vestigial memory of one's own childhood, and similar explanations merely beg the question. But if, giving this proposition a slight twist, we were to say, the child motif is a picture of certain forgotten things in our childhood, we are getting closer to the truth. Since, however, the archetype is always an image belonging to the whole human race and not merely to the individual, we might put it better this way. The child motif represents the preconscious childhood aspect of the collective psyche. End quote. Okay, so again, there's no real clear describing it. Putting it in language is just substituting new images for it. It's not necessarily completely comprehensible because it only speaks to us in metaphors. He says the most we can do is dream the myth onwards and give it a modern dress. So, in other words, a sort of participation in the myth. Not to just analyze it, but to experience it in order to truly connect with the collective unconscious. It's not the sort of thing that can be simply described and comprehended. It has to be experienced. So he says the most we can do is to dream the myth onward and give it a modern dress. So in some sense, the mythological manifestations of the archetypes from the ancient world are not necessarily the metaphors and manifestations that are going to speak to us most clearly in the present. Although I'm obviously drawn to the ancient Greek religion and the manifestation of the archetypes therein, it must be remembered that for the ancient Greeks, none of that stuff was ancient. It was all very alive. The gods wore the same kind of clothes that they wore, more or less. The gods were like them. And for us to think about gods and goddesses as wearing togas and sandals means that they're nothing like us. And we have not given it a modern dress, so to speak, in the most basic manner. We have not modernized even the clothing that we envision the gods wearing. We have not brought them into the present world. And we can't even necessarily do that conceptually. We can only do it by experiencing new mythological dreams. Another line I like is where he says, the archetype is an element of our psychic structure and thus a vital and necessary component in our psychic economy. It represents or personifies certain instinctive data of the dark primitive psyche, the real but invisible roots of our consciousness. So the idea being that like your unconscious mind sort of existed before your conscious mind, that in the process of growing up from a child, you go from a child who is largely existing on his most basic unconscious level with only a glimmer of consciousness as we would understand it as adults, and that consciousness and that self-awareness develops over time. And similarly, in the process of evolution, there's a sort of dwarfed consciousness of the animal world where the components of the unconscious really drive more of the animal kingdom. Animals don't have the same brains that we have. The so-called lizard brain, the primordial components of the brain take up a larger percentage. And what parts of the brain we use as really like the drivers of our consciousness and our rationality, our prefrontal cortex and such, the modern developments of the brain don't exist in nearly the same size and as prominent a part of the brains of animals. And so, in a sense, the archetypes represent early structures of the brain that he describes as the roots of consciousness. And he says that we only arrive at the meaning of a physical organ when we begin to ask teleological questions. Hence the query arises, what is the biological purpose of the archetype? Just as physiology answers such a question for the body, so it's the business of psychology to answer it for the archetype. So the idea here is that it is a biological phenomena. First of all, we have to keep coming back to that the human mind itself is a biological phenomena. The archetypes are biological phenomena, so that in some sense it seems as though with adequate knowledge one could trace, this is obviously not the sort of thing that we could do today, but one could trace the shapes of these archetypes and understand things about these archetypes simply by looking into the physical structures of the human brain. Now, the human brain's complexity is so great that that's really just a sort of whimsical concept at this point. But if it is biological, if it is physically manifested in the brain, then it can be studied and understood theoretically. But they're understood by asking, what is the purpose? What is the purpose of this, like when you're physically, what is the purpose of this organ? What is it? Why do we have it? What does it do for us? And the same question can be asked of archetypes. What is the function? What is the purpose of the archetypes? And then the last little line there, I think is important to point out as well. The child motif represents the preconscious childhood aspect of the collective psyche. So the earliest components of the collective psyche, the preconscious aspect. So that's pretty cool. In a way, the child could sort of stand in for representing the unconscious itself. Anyhow, let me jump forward to this section where he says, quote, the child motif represents not only something that existed in the distant past, but also something that exists now. That is to say, it's not just a vestige, but a system functioning in the present, whose purpose is to compensate or correct, in a meaningful manner, the inevitable one-sidedness and extravagances of the conscious mind. It is in the nature of the conscious mind to concentrate on relatively few contents and to raise them to the highest pitch of clarity. A necessary result and precondition is the exclusion of other potential contents of consciousness. The exclusion is bound to bring about a certain one-sidedness of the conscious contents. Since the differentiated consciousness of civilized man has been granted an effective instrument for the practical realization of its contents through the dynamics of his will, there is all the more danger, the more he trains his will, of him getting lost in one-sidedness and deviating further and further from the laws and roots of his being. This means, on the one hand, the possibility of human freedom, but on the other, it is a source of endless transgressions against one's instincts. Accordingly, primitive man being closer to his instincts, like the animal, is characterized by fear of novelty and adherence to tradition. To our way of thinking, he is painfully backward, whereas we exalt progress. But our progressiveness, though it may result in a great many delightful wish fulfillments, piles up an equally gigantic Promethean debt, which has to be paid off from time to time in the form of hideous catastrophes. For ages, man has dreamed of flying, and all we have got for it is saturation bombing. End quote. So a bit briefer section there, but just the premise that, so the archetype of the child, or really any archetypes, they're not just parts of our distant past. We still have them because they still serve a role and function for us today, and particularly in the modern world, what happens is that the conscious mind is built to calculate. It's built to focus. Thinks about a certain thing, thinks about it in an in-depth manner, and struggles with it and wrestles with it and tries to come up with a solution to whatever problem it is that can only be solved by consciousness. And it gets better at solving a certain class of consciousness. And our civilization divides people up to serve in different roles, and their conscious mind is always geared toward one sort of problem or one sort of project. And all sorts of other potential things to be thought about never really get thought about. And this leaves us in a one-sided state. It leaves us overly involved with our consciousness and not involved enough with our unconscious mind. And it leaves certain aspects of life unaddressed. And so one of the things about the unconscious is that it's constantly pulling people back from one-sidedness. Don't go too far down that road. You've got to address all of the parts of life, all of the different things that make up a human life, all of the different interactions and everything else that make up a healthy human life has to be addressed. To the extent that certain things remain unaddressed, there's an imbalance there and an unhealthiness. And he talks a little bit about how although we have stepped further away from our balanced instincts, we think of primitives as being backwards, but he's got a bit of a dig against progressive technological expansion. He says our progressiveness may result in a great many delightful wish fulfillments, and he's really talking about technological progress. It piles up a Promethean debt which has to be paid off from time to time. So anyway, let's move forward from there to where he talks about the future orientation of the child motif or the child archetype. He says, quote, "One of the essential features of the child motif is its futurity. The child is potential future. Hence, the occurrence of the child motif in the psychology of the individual signifies, as a rule, an anticipation of future developments, even though at first sight it may seem like a retrospective configuration. Life is a flux, a flowing into the future, not a stoppage or a backwash. It is therefore not surprising that so many of the mythological saviors are child gods. This agrees exactly with our experience of the psychology of the individual, which shows that the child paves the way for a future change of personality. In the individuation process, it anticipates the figure that comes from the synthesis of conscious and unconscious elements in the personality. It is therefore a symbol which unites the opposites, a mediator, bringer of healing, that is, one who makes whole. Because it has this meaning, the child motif is capable of the numerous transformations mentioned above. It can be expressed by roundness, the circle or sphere, or else by quaternity as another form of wholeness. I have called this wholeness that transcends consciousness the self. The goal of the individuation process is the synthesis of the self." End quote. So, short section there. He doesn't really talk about this concept of futurity, future-facing, of childhood, all that much. I think it's. In my opinion, it seems important. An important aspect of the child archetype is its relationship to the future and to possibility and things of that nature. He doesn't talk about it all that much, though, just a little. Anyway, moving on. He talks a little bit about the abandonment of the child. We talked about this a little under the section that Kerenyi had written about, but now here's Jung's take on that. He says, quote, "Abandonment, exposure, danger, etc. are all elaborations of the child's insignificant beginnings and of its mysterious and miraculous birth. This statement describes a certain psychic experience of a creative nature, whose object is the emergence of a new and as yet unknown content. In the psychology of the individual, there is always, at such moments, an agonizing situation of conflict from which there seems to be no way out, at least for the conscious mind, since as far as this is concerned, there is no third way. But out of this collision of opposites, the unconscious psyche always creates a third thing, of an irrational nature, which the conscious mind neither expects nor understands. It presents itself in a form that is neither a straight yes nor a straight no, and is consequently rejected by both. For the conscious mind knows nothing beyond the opposites, and as a result has no knowledge of the thing that unites them. Since, however, the solution of the conflict through the union of opposites is of vital importance, and is moreover the very thing that the conscious mind is longing for, some inkling of the creative act and of the significance of it nevertheless gets through. From this comes the numinous character of the child. A meaningful but unknown content always has a secret fascination for the conscious mind. The new configuration is a nascent whole. It is on the way to wholeness, at least insofar as it excels in wholeness the conscious mind when torn by opposites and surpasses it in completeness. For this reason, all uniting symbols have a redemptive significance. Out of this situation, the child emerges as a symbolic content, manifestly separated or even isolated from its background, the mother, but sometimes including the mother in its perilous situation. Threatened on the one hand by the negative attitude of the conscious mind, and on the other by the horror vacui of the unconscious, which is quite ready to swallow up all its progeny, since it produces them only in play, and destruction is an inescapable part of its play. Nothing in all the world welcomes this new birth, although it is the most precious fruit of Mother Nature herself, the most pregnant with the future, signifying a higher state of self-realization. That is why nature, the world of the instincts, takes the child under its wing. It is nourished or protected by animals. Child means something evolving towards independence. This it cannot do without detaching itself from its origins. Abandonment is therefore a necessary condition, not just a concomitant symptom. The conflict is not to be overcome by the conscious mind, remaining caught between the opposites, and for this very reason it needs a symbol to point out the necessity of detaching itself from its origins. Because the symbol of the child fascinates and grips the conscious mind, its redemptive effect passes over into consciousness and brings about that separation from the conflict situation which the conscious mind by itself was unable to achieve. The symbol anticipates a nascent state of consciousness. So long as this is not actually in being, the child remains a mythological projection, which requires religious repetition and renewal by ritual." End quote. So what are we dealing with here? So this is the section, the abandonment of the child. And the idea is that there is a conflict. He describes a certain psychic experience of a creative nature whose object is the emergence of a new and as yet unknown content. He says, in the psychology of the individual, there is always at such moments an agonizing situation of conflict, from which there seems to be no way out. So there's the conscious mind in a state of conflict, some problem that needs to get solved, something that the conscious mind is not able to solve. And the unconscious mind, in order to lead the conscious mind into what seems to be a sort of higher state of consciousness, of understanding in this creative act, understanding what must be done for this psychic experience, this creative psychic experience, the child is a sort of concept that the unconscious mind brings forward as a symbol to represent the unification of the opposites, the unification of whatever two primary conflicting forces create the struggle for the new creative birth in the first place. He says, quote, "Out of the collision of opposites, the unconscious psyche always creates a third thing of an irrational nature, which the conscious mind neither expects nor understands." He says, "From this comes the numinous character of the child." He says, "The new configuration, which is this third unification of the opposites, is a nascent whole. It's on the way to wholeness. So it's presenting a vision of wholeness, and it excels the conscious mind in wholeness when the conscious mind is torn by opposites. And for this reason," he says, "all uniting symbols have a redemptive significance." He also says, "Child means something evolving toward independence, and that it cannot do without detaching itself from its origins. So abandonment of some sort is a necessary condition." And of course, there's the simple, obvious premise that man and woman together make child. So the obvious symbolism of a pair of opposites in unity, producing the third solution to the problem in the form of a child. So that's pretty straightforward. So I think I will leave it at that. Interesting stuff. I think that there's certain areas, to my mind, that didn't get adequately explored. In particular, the child motif's relationship with time. But that's okay. Something worth thinking about. And I think we got a little bit of insight in this book about how Carl Jung approaches the archetypes. In his essays in this book, he makes an effort to try to like lay the foundation in a quick manner, in a brief manner, to lay out the entirety of his premise about analytical psychology and the archetypes and the collective unconscious. He sort of lays out his basic concepts for us clearly so that we have the tools we need to discuss the archetype of the child. And I wholeheartedly appreciate that. So now that we have taken a little bit of time to look at the concept of the child, let the new year begin, and I will talk to you next time. Goodbye.